As was mentioned, the Cultural Heritage Centre has an exhibition down the line. They have been having an exhibition each year since they opened the refurbished Civic Centre, and the exhibition stands for 12 months. And I was somewhat privileged and quite proud that instead of engaging a professional exhibition designer, that they've decided to give local expertise a try and draw upon what I knew about the local postal office history and telecommunications history of the town. And I then drew upon all of my collector friends to find exhibits and the like, and then we combined that with things at the Heritage Centre and the National Trust and a few other organisations loaned to us. And the exhibition has been very successful in terms of visitor numbers, and just recently they did some calculations, 63% up on last year's for the same period of people coming along. And a lot of it is kids coming in to play with the telephones because they've never seen it before, so it's quite novel. Now, as part of that research, which you can read on all the panels of the exhibition in the Heritage Centre, we've discovered a lot of things which we'll call mythbusters for what was well-known or well-accepted folklore of Gawler's post office history. And on Sunday was actually the 50th anniversary of the opening of Tod Street Post Office. So what I'm doing tonight is combining those interesting bits which sort of broke with the folklore of Gawler's knowledge of the post office, and a fairly concise and fast 50-year history of the post office since it's been in Tod Street. So we'll start off with the early stuff first, and these were some of the things where we found new information that was not in the previously accepted written histories of the Gawler Post Office. So the first one is the first Gawler Post Office, which was previously assumed to be at the Old Spot Hotel with Henry Calton. How the early mails between Adelaide and Gawler were transported. We found references to two postmasters which were not in the history before, in 1852 to 4. The first official postmaster, so that was a postmaster who didn't run post office as part of another job or another shop. That was in 1863 to 1867, where previously it was assumed that they were in the telegraph station and shared that, but they weren't. They were actually in a rented shop about where Chibo now is. And some new information on the signalling of the arrival of the mails, with reference to Popham's Cannon and a few other things we've discovered since. So, first records, these are actually difficult to see, I know, but they're actually photographs taken from a microfilm viewer, so it's the best quality I could get at the time, but we are getting digital prints of these. And this is the correspondence from the Colonial Secretary of the Governor about mail services to Gawler. And these indicate that there was a petition taken up, and the first post office was actually in the Bushman Hotel, and Mr. Robertson was the first postmaster in 1840, which predates even Henry Calton's arrival in Gawler. Now, the Bushman Hotel is 3 variations of the building prior to the one that's there now. I can't find any illustrations of the Bushman's Hotel as it was at the time when Robertson had it as a post office. But it was a substantial transport hub and overnight stop for all the travellers going north and also coming south with the overlanders from Sydney bringing cattle and sheep across. The last one shows some signatures on there, including people like John Reed and others who are well known as pioneers in Gawler. This is actually an extract from a British newspaper about South Australia, which shows the state of the post office establishment there. This was published in September 42, so the information is probably already 4 to 6 months old before it got to England, so it brings you back to probably the first or second quarter of 1842, where we have the list of post offices, all 2, 4, 6, 7 of them, and Gawler Town there is the only one north of Adelaide. Now, the early mails, when Robertson was appointed postmaster, he was asked to arrange the carriage of mails at no cost to the government, which generally meant finding somebody to carry it for free. There is sort of a part of the folklore is that it was given to bullock draymen to carry mails to and from Adelaide. But in this early period, the bullock draymen really weren't great numbers in the traffic because they really didn't come about until the mines opened up, and that wasn't until 1844 and 45. And who's going to trust a bullocky with your post, really? The other problem with that theory is, of course, the bullockys were all going to Port Adelaide. They didn't go to Adelaide. That's where they were going to meet the ships. So I think we fairly well smashed that particular bit of folklore. But who actually brought the mails? There were actually parcel carriers coming up to Gawler every week, once or twice a week. And I believe these are the people who carried the mails. And one of those actually ended up being John Harvey, who of Salisbury fame, and he was contracted to carry the mails by Henry Calton. Right, now when Henry Calton set his sister up in Sarah Calton in a hotel in 1842, so Sarah Calton actually bought the old Spot Hotel, which at the time was a part of a deceased estate of a gentleman called Nelson Tooth, who we believe, we actually can't find any documentary evidence, but since it was in his estate, we believe he must have bought it, and he would have bought it from Mr. Scheidner, who went bankrupt. So they came through there. Now, Mr. Tooth died early on, but he was from Sydney as one of the cattle overlanders, and he was also a member of the Tooth family who had the Kent Brewery of great fame across New South Wales. And it's a brewer which lasted for over a century. So interesting that we had a brewer, a member of a brewing family having a pub here in Gawler and being one of the early postmasters. Now his sister, Sarah Calton, was a single woman when she arrived here in Adelaide with her two brothers. Now what we don't know is who had the money. We don't know whether the sister had the money or the brothers set her up. Now, if she was a widow, it's quite likely she did have money, and she actually was the owner of the Calton, what was called Calton's Hotel for many a year, and she developed that building from basically a bush hut to quite a substantial building, which is you'll probably see later. Now, Henry Calton had a club in Adelaide, in Hiney Street, and it would seem that he was obviously developing some sort of a family dynasty very early on in the piece, because he had no hesitations in approaching the governor to offer a mail service on the proviso he would become a postmaster of Gawler. And one of the incentives for that, of course, is if he could get all of the travellers and all of the locals to come to his pub, as opposed to the Robertson's pub, he's going to get that business. So it made sense to make your business a go-to place in the area. So here's the copies of the correspondence between Henry Calton and the governor's private secretary, which ended up with him being officially appointed on the 31st of December 1842. But that's when they made the decision in Adelaide, and probably in practical terms, it was probably January 1843 before he actually did the work. Now, Henry Calton had a fairly colourful career here in Gawler. Some people may have seen him referred to as the great Pooh-Bah of Gawler, and he was certainly one of the pioneers who promoted the place very, very enthusiastically. He ended up going broke in his business in Hiney Street, so he came up to Gawler on a permanent basis and managed the hotel for his sister, while his sister actually engaged builders to expand the hotel. So between them, they were expanding the hotel. He managed to pay off all of his debts and become solvent again. He then became a full partner with his sister, and then later on he bought her out. And she went back to England for a couple of years and then came back again, and then they tried to sell the business, not with any great success. And it ended up, they sold the leasehold, but not the actual business to new publicans. Now, Henry Calton resigned in 1852 here in January. He was a bit miffed. He had several government jobs here in Gawler, and there was a certain German person from out of Buxfeld who used to come into Gawler and give him a really hard time, and Henry Carlton had no explanation as to why he should be given such a hard time. And he basically said, you know, if we don't do something about this bloke, I'm out of here. And this got reported in the Adelaide papers, and the Adelaide papers actually published that he had quit his job, although he hadn't actually quit. So he read of his own, resignation in the Adelaide papers, and 2 weeks later he said, bugger it, I will resign, and he got out. And he was succeeded by a gentleman called Warnford Stedman, who was a local pharmacist, a chemist shop, probably somewhere about where Essex House now is. But because he was so busy as a pharmacist, he actually employed, we believe, family members to run it. So we think he was run by the 2 brothers-in-law, because he married a Holloway here in Gawler. And the two brothers-in-law and the servant girl had free run of the post office, and the guarantor of the post office was Dr. Marnie, who was a bit of a stickler in early Gawler history. And Dr. Marnie complained to the government about the conduct of the post office by these 2 brothers and the servant girl, and so they ended up giving Stedman the sack. And there's a glorious petition in the State Records Office signed by every luminary of Gawler at the time, trying to get Stedman reinstated, because they could see it wasn't his fault, and it was a slur on his character that he should be sacked. But the government held to their decision, and a gentleman called Thomas Grant, who I can find very little about, succeeded him. Now, I did find out that Thomas Grant was previously the postmaster at Coringa, now Borough, and he was fairly heavily involved in the lodges around the area as well. And then next up we have George Gossard. I have no appointment date for George Gossard, except he first appears listed as a postmaster in early 1854. And Gossard ran a bakery here in Gawler on the corner of Walker Place and Murray Street, where the Subway sandwich shop now is. And they actually paid him enough so he was able to employ people to do the post office business while he continued doing the bakery business. And he actually employed the first letter carrier in Gawler, and it's actually been stated that the first mails of the day used to be delivered with the bread, so to the people of the town. Gossard died suddenly in 1863, and Herbert Dean was actually the person engaged to do the postal business at the time, and he assumed he was going to become the new postmaster. But the government had other ideas, and they decided then they were going to put their own person in the town. But Dean did buy the bakery business from Gossard's widow, and that's where we get the term Dean's Corner from, for that particular building. And it's quite appropriate that with the Subway here before it and a couple of other sort of sandwich bars in there before it, that particular corner has been a place to buy a lunch or buy your bread for 160 years, 170 years, so quite remarkable. Now, when the government decided that they weren't going to have the post office run by part-timers anymore, they actually moved it into the telegraph station, and the locals really did not like that, because if you've been into the Trust Museum, forget about the big space out the back, just think about the little space at the front. That's all there was to run a post office and a telegraph and a savings bank, which was all the things that were there at the time. So they petitioned the locals and said, no, we want them in a separate building. So at that particular time, James Martin was actually rebuilding the old spot for about the 3rd time, I think it was being rebuilt. And next to the old spot, he put up a row of 4 shops. And so the government leased one of those 4 shops. And it's really irritating because the descriptions of the shops I can find telling that the post office was in the middle one, which doesn't help you when there's 4 of them. But these shops were tiny. They were really tiny. These are the dimensions. 16 feet 9 by 15 feet 3, so that's 4 paces by 5 paces, or 6 paces by 5 paces. Now this had the post office at the front, it had a middle area where the mails were delivered and dispatched and sorted, and a living area behind that, which was basically 2 bunk beds here, 2 bunk beds here, and a passageway in between, then the back door, and somewhere they found room for a servant girl as well. So you imagine living in those circumstances. I mean, living above the shop is a phrase that a lot of shopkeepers will know, but this is only still a single storage shop. And he was in there for 4 years with his wife, 2 children and a servant girl. And basically a free access from the back to the front, because behind that was still the stables for the hotel, and quite often the drunks would mistake his back door for the pub door and just walk straight through. Yeah. So that's when they petitioned to get the new post office, which of course is the one we all know and love in Murray Street today. Now, the other bit of information we discovered was about Popham's gun. Now, the folklore is that this gun came off the Buffalo, and I've always looked at that suspiciously. I mean, thinking, why would that gun have come off the Buffalo and survived? Well, it all comes back to the point that Popham, when he lived in Glenelg, actually fired one of the guns from the Buffalo, which was rusting on the sandhills of Glenelg at the time. And so that particular act went all the way through to 1953, when the gun was offered to the town of Gawler with the provenance that it came from the Buffalo and must therefore be quite historic. But the Buffalo guns have actually never left Glenelg, and they're actually still on display next to the old gum tree now, both of them. So it can't be off the Buffalo. Where it's from, we really don't know, but there is a small possibility it could have actually been founded and made here in Gawler. All we know about its early history is that it was purchased by George Corsby, who had the Criterion Hotel at Gawler South, but he was also a major shopkeeper and benefactor of Gawler in the 1860s, so that's there. Now, prior to Popham's gun, we discovered some new information that the station master at Gawler, Thomas Percival, began raising a flag to tell the people of Gawler that the English mailboats had arrived. And the Bunyip actually in 1863 started a campaign and an appeal to raise funds to buy him a cannon so he could signal when the mails had arrived from overseas. So we had a cannon at the Gawler railway station for a while, firing off when the mails arrived. And then in 1866, Popham got his gun, and he was also firing off a cannon and raising a flag at the front of his house. And the other remarkable thing we then discovered is that the publican of the Prince Albert Hotel decided he was going to raise a flagpole in front of his hotel, also to tell people that the mails had arrived, but also, you know, as to make his hotel the beacon for information in Gawler. And he put up a 60-foot high flagpole next to the hotel. And remarkably, you can actually see remnants of a flagpole still here in this picture. And then in this picture of the tyre yard, which I think is in the early 1960s, there's still a flagpole there. So there must be people here who could remember a flagpole being in that particular site. But 60 feet high is still, that's higher than the post office tower and higher than any building in Murray Street. It was also used, they would put up lanterns for drills for fire and militia and things like that, and put up the flags. So that was a bit of new information we discovered doing the research. So there's a quick timeline on Popham's gun. When Popham Senior died in 1871, his son was actually learning medicine, and he was actually serving as a doctor with the Prussian army in the Franco-Prussian War. And believe it or not, when the news arrived in Gawler that the Prussians had defeated the French in the Franco-Prussian War, they borrowed the gun and fired a 22-gun salute in Murray Street to celebrate that. Now, another one of the myths around is that the Gawler telegraph station was part of the Overland Telegraph Line. Now, the Gawler telegraph station was built in 1860, so that predates the telegraph line by 12 years. The Overland Telegraph Line technically went from Port Augusta to Port Darwin, but when they made the decision to build that line, they actually strung up a new line between Adelaide and Port Augusta along the railway lines. So the Overland Telegraph Line went by Gawler, not into Gawler. So it actually ran along the railway lines all the way through up to Port Augusta. And they just strung a new line to connect with the overland telegraph line. This is a circuit map, which is difficult for you to read, of course, but one of these is the Port Augusta line, which shows Gawler as a branch and not on the line. So these were the myths that have been busted. So I never ever want to see these uttered or appear in print again because they were wrong. So, okay, first post office was at the Bushman's, not the old spot. Mails were unlikely to have been carried by bullock drays. Certainly official mails, I doubt, but somebody may have still handed a letter to someone to carry per favour. I can't discount that. There's 2 extra postmasters between Calton and Gosard. The post office was not in the telegraph station from 63 to 67. Now the other interesting thing is that a lot of people assume that the telegraph went into the new post office in 1867. It didn't. It stayed where it was until 1871. And that then occurred because the post office and telegraph were amalgamated in 1870. Popham's Cannon's not from the Buffalo, and Gawler wasn't a repeater station, so strike all of those from your memory. Now we've also found some really compelling stories as part of this research. Some things, you can always say you can't make this stuff up. So I was amazed to find we had a black postman in Gawler in the 1870s delivering letters. There was cast iron pillar boxes in Murray Street, and one of those exploded. The 1889 flood, which was probably the worst flood to hit Gawler, had some really interesting consequences to the postal services in the town. There was a pensioner revolt in 1912 against the postmaster who'd come in at the time. And of course, we had a claimant to be Australia's oldest mail contractor. Because we need to remember that mails getting to and from Gawler, or once they get to the Gawler railway station, get into the post office, they were generally done by contractors rather than the Australian Post or PMG staff. So the Black Postman, in 1875, the newspapers reported the attempted suicide of James Green, a man of colour and a letter carrier in Gawler. I think, well, this is odd. Well, firstly, it was odd, because the role of the blacks in South Australia at the time is really not very well documented. Aboriginal was given jobs as letter carriers in government departments seems very odd to me. So I started to do some further research on this gentleman, James Green, and he himself has a colourful history because he actually appeared in the official records because he attempted suicide 3 times. And of course that was a crime, and so he ended up in court on these times. This particular attempt, he ended up in the Adelaide Hospital, so there are Adelaide Hospital records which speak about Mr. Green. And it turns out, Mr. Green was actually from the West Indies. So, and he is probably a ship jumper, because I can find no record of his entry into Australia, or he came here as crew because the ship that he claimed to come out on was actually went to Launceston in Tasmania and was actually in Launceston for about 6 months in 1863, waiting for it to be loaded with a new cargo. And at the time in Launceston, there was a great practice of agents for other ships poaching crew, and with the incentives of we'll pay you far more. But of course, technically, they were deserting from the other ships. So when they went to go to the other agent, they just said, "You now work for us for nothing. Otherwise, we're going to turn you in as a deserter." Right? It was a pretty common practice. So people working under those conditions, you would understand, first opportunity to jump ship, they're probably going to do it. And we think that's how he got into Adelaide. He's ended up, after this instance, he went back to Adelaide where he was a hansom cab driver. And that got me looking at early photographs of the Adelaide city streets, looking at all the cab drivers, and there's not many white ones there, they're nearly all black. So they're quite likely Indians, West Indians, working in Adelaide at the time with those jobs. So 150 years on, nothing's changed. Exploding pillar boxes. These are lovely things. So we had pillar boxes here from 1864, and this is the pillar box that was on the corner of Murray Street and Jacob Street. There's still a letterbox there today. There's been a letterbox on that corner for 160 odd years, so it's quite the thing. Now, of course, this predates electric light and all of those sorts of things, so they had gas lamps in the street at the time, but they were expensive, and nobody really wanted to give up footpath space for them. So someone came up with the idea of putting a gas lamp on top of the pillar box. And so they did that, and they pushed the pillar box right to the edge of the footpath so it could be seen along Murray Street and up and down Jacob Street. And of course, they used to have, from a gas main, a pipe running through the pillar box up to the lamp. And occasionally these things would spring a leak. And the chamber of the pillar box, where people would drop their letters, would fill up with gas until they would start leaking out of the aperture where people put the letters in, and any poor sod walking past with a lit cigarette would ignite it. And this is what happened. So it happened here in Gawler, it happened in a case in North Adelaide as well, and in the city as well. So these things would explode. So they wouldn't shatter into a million pieces. Normally they would blow the door off, because that was the weakest point from the hinges, and apparently the door ended up on the other side of Murray Street. So it would have been quite a fright. This is a drawing from an advertisement, which clearly shows the pillar box there on that corner. It's the only picture I've got of it with the lamp on top. I've got other pictures of it without the lamp. The 1889 flood was significant. This is actually a sketch of the remains of the Williston Bridge, and you can see the Williston store and post office behind that. So 1st and 2nd of April, we had 5.5 inches of rain in the catchment area for the rivers here. North Para flooded, every bridge was washed away except the railway bridge, and further north, the River Light was reported to be 4 miles across at Manala. Now that's a fair distance. So what did they do? So they actually, for a while, carried the mails by foot across the railway bridge. So the contractor would take it from Gawler to the bridge, walk across it back to Williston and back around again. They then ended up actually stringing a flying fox across the buttresses on either side of the river from the old bridge. And they used to tie a sack to it and swing it across the river and back again. Now, some of the other interesting things that came about from this flood is the North Para River was so high that they couldn't get carts through, and then when it got to a certain level where they could get a cart across it, if it rained again upstream, of course it would go up and down, according to the rains. So they actually arranged to get Mr. Todd's weather maps that were being there and his forecasts in 1889 sent to Gawler so that the locals could work out whether it was safe to load up a cart to go across the river forward or not. And consequently, we became one of the first towns in the state to get Todd's weather reports and forecasts sent to the town daily in 1889, predating the civic buildings in Adelaide, predating the State Library by several years. So that was quite an interesting achievement. The next one is the Pensioners' Revolt. So Thomas Bradshaw was the postmaster of Alice Springs. He's actually quite a famous person in Alice Springs. There's actually a suburb of Alice Springs named after him, and a school is named after him. So he came to Gawler in 1912. Now 1912 is also the same year when the PMG's department did a deal with the Commonwealth Bank, so they handled the Commonwealth banking business. And of course, just a couple of years earlier than that, the government in 1908 brought in old age pensions. So Mr. Bradshaw thought he didn't want all of these pensions coming in like Brown's cows over a period of a fortnight to come and collect their pensions, so he sent a message to every pensioner in the town to come to the post office at 10 a.m. on pension day to line up and get your money. So all the pensioners rocked up at the post office at 10 a.m, completely filled the waiting room, that's the business part of the area. No one else could get in, and it overflowed into a queue onto the street. Now you can imagine what that would have been like on a hot summer's day or in the weather. And the pensioners got a bit miffed and complained to the council. The council took up the case, and they ended up Mr Bradshaw got transferred to Port Pirie. Right. Our claimant for the oldest mail contract, Teddy Allwood, who anyone who's lived in Gawler will remember Teddy Allwood, if not for his reputation or his bad driving or the fact he'd fill up his car with as many kids as he could squeeze in and cart them around at about 8 kilometres an hour to and from school and football games. I actually remember Teddy because he used to pick up the pensioners and their shopping from Foodland when I started working there in the 70s. So he used to do that. I think he used to deliver railway parcels as well with Lloyd Modra. So he had lived in the town most of his life, and interestingly, he also has, you know, some coloured background, being half Jamaican and half Irish. So that's a good combination. Probably explains why he was such a good boxer as well. But the celebrations here was for his 90th birthday, where he was actually still the mail contract from 90, and he actually died at 92, and he still held the contract for carrying the mails between the railway station and the post office and emptying the letterboxes around the town as well. So a remarkable asset and for the town, and unsurprisingly he's in the 2007 book about Gawler's significant citizens. One of the other things that not many people will know of in the Second World War, they formed things called next of kin committees in major towns, and the postmaster was always a part of that, because if there was a fatality in the armed services during the war, usually the first people in the town to know about it is the telegraph staff and the telegram boy, and he would have to go and deliver one of these, to the point where telegram boys were feared in the Second World War. And I know that Janine Hinton, who is the daughter of Graham Dorr, who used to have to deliver them telegrams as a boy, would often say that that was his worst memory as opposed to working in the post office department. So it was those. The post office actually brought out a special telegram that didn't have advertising and other things printed on it, and this is an example of one of those. It's one of 3 that I know of. There should be a few of these for Gawler, but I've never seen one. So if any of the families are holding one of those, either if you want to sell it, see me. If you want to donate it, see the RSL or the Heritage Centre. The other interesting thing is about letter delivery to the houses. Now, early on, the letters were actually taken to the front door, and people would knock on the front door and they'd be handed the letter. So by the 1920s, when there was a lot more houses being served by letter carriers, the government decided they'd put the time and motion for people to study it all, and they worked out that there was too much time wasted walking up and down the footpath and waiting for people to answer a door. So they brought in a rule that if your front door didn't have a letter chute and was more than 12 feet from the footpath, you had to put up a letterbox on your front fence, front gate. And this was a design that was approved by the government and manufactured by an Adelaide company, Simpsons. You could have a deluxe model with a little glass window in the back so you could see if any letters were sitting in there, so you didn't have to open it. And they came in 1924, and there's probably still some of them around on people's gates. I was looking for one for the display. I've seen 2 in Adelaide still in use in the back streets in Adelaide. Everyone speaks about getting the telegram from the Queen, or now for the King. The telegrams for the 100th birthday and 60th wedding anniversaries actually started in 1917, which surprised me, but I don't think they really took off in Australia until the 1940s, when the Duke of Gloucester became Governor General. And telegrams, of course, finished in 1989, so these things will and do exist for Gawler, because I've seen the newspaper reports about people receiving them. I do have some of these in my collection, but none to a Gawler person. So once again, if there's any Gawler family people holding on to these as part of the family history, then we'd certainly like to see them. The other significant things that affected the post office, of course, was in Gawler South in 1928. They decided suddenly to change all the street names to 1st Street, 2nd Street, 3rd Street, 4th Street. How boring. But at the time, apparently there were 3 Queen Streets, 2 Express Streets, and 3 River Streets and things like that between Gawler South and Gawler. So that was their reasoning for doing it. So here's couple of cards here addressed to the original street names, Blanche Street in Gawler South, as opposed to the one in Gawler East, and Broughton Street, which is also in Gawler South. Now, one gentleman, Ron Folland, was also worked in the PMG's department. He had a fascination with Gawler street names, so he was real keen on this and had them all there. And I did read in the Bunyips, there's been at least 2 attempts to change the names back again, but both of them have been pretty resoundingly rejected because they said it was going to actually cause far more confusion than the current system. The other one was the renumbering of the various businesses in Gawler, and in fact this was Australia-wide, and the equivalent of what's now the Local Government Association came up with some sort of a formula for working out the numbering of premises on the streets. And basically you'd have a main road, and then as you went off a main road, the odds would be on one side and the evens would be on the other side. And of course the problem is you don't really know what was determined as the main road and what side they started from. The main road, when they started numbering from 1 on one side and 2 on the other. But Murray Street was one of the streets affected, so all of the premises of Murray Street, the odds and evens swap sides. Which is why sometimes if you're looking at old advertisements and it'll say it was 56 Murray Street and it'll say it's on the wrong side of the street, and that's the reason why. Right, unusual postal items are some of the things we featured in the exhibition. I collect mail that's had unusual things happen to it. I'm trying to find a photograph of this incident. So this is in 1928. This is the mails were carried on the train, and in 1928 this particular train, there's a picture of it before it burnt, caught fire. The petrol leaked from the engine and it caught fire and was burnt down to the chassis, and all the mail bags were chucked off in various states of disrepair. The railway parcels also. All the passengers and the drivers got out safely, and they basically just bumped the engine with another, bumped the rail car with an engine underneath one of the standpipes and just put it out that way. But I've got to think there's got to be a photograph of that somewhere, but can't find it, and the Rail Museum does not have one. Actually, that incident did lead to a change of the design of the rail car, so that's something effect. So that is one of 2 known examples to be salvaged from the fire, both addressed to the same person, who was the wife of the secretary of the Tod Stamp Club, which probably explains why it survived. The race courses also have a little interesting postal history for services. So very recently, in fact, even in the 1880s, there would be a temporary telegraph office set up at the race course, so that the bookies in Adelaide could learn the results of the races quicker. And that was the only reason why. So they were pretty influential even in the 1880s. And you can actually still see insulators from the telegraph lines on the side of that building now, on the side of the grandstand, because that's the telegraph office was in the secretary's office. Now, I never thought I would ever see a telegram from the Gawler racecourse, and remarkably I bought a collection in Germany, and when I was going through it, my eyes popped out of my head, because there was a telegram sent from the Gawler races in 1918. So, and this lucky person had £10 on this horse waterway, so they had £10 on a horse which paid £2.14 for each pound. In 1918, it would have been a fortune. Now we come to Tod Street. On Sunday was the 50th anniversary of Tod Street, and they sort of got out of the Murray Street building mainly because the telephone people were actually just swamping the place, and they were taking up more and more room for the telephone business, so there was nothing much left for the post office business, so they decided they needed new premises, and they acquired this property on the corner where it now is. It was previously the Marchings property, but the Marchings didn't own it at the time that they acquired it. A very unusual triangular block. Very divided opinion on the merits of the building as a piece of architecture. I actually quite like it, but a lot of people hate it. So I think they made good use of the block. We don't know who the architects were because it was done by a government department, which is disappointing that we can't find that out. So that was a plan or photograph of a little model showing how it was going to look when it was built. And of course it was opened 50 years ago last Sunday, and it was opened by Senator Drury, who was the Minister of Posts at the time. So we have a picture of him with the unveiling of the plaque, which is still there now, and a picture of Harold Marsh, who was the then postmaster, unlocking the front door for the first time. And there, the first customer was apparently Dawn Eastick, who bought 3 stamps. So I'm trying to find out whether a photograph of that exists. That's a letter from my collection posted on the opening day as a souvenir, and from the Gawler History Team's website, the illustration of the official invitation. Now, the post office there sort of operated quite unassumingly for many years until Australia, well, it went through the change from a PMG's department to Australia Post. But in the early 1990s, Australia Post decided they want to be involved in the retail market as well as the post business. So from about 1992 is when they started filling up the post office areas with retail product, making them into shops. And in the early 1990s is also when we start seeing all the complaints about the queues of people and the long waits it took. Also in the early 1990s is when a lot of things became electronic, and they didn't always work successfully the first time round, and they were a lot slower than they are nowadays. And so the principal changes to that building that I've determined. So 1992 they put in the shop. Also in 1992 they took out the mail sorting and the postmarking business away from the offices, and that was all part of the Australia Post goal of having 6 o'clock closing, and everything's taken to a city mail exchange for processing now. So I was surprised to see that was that long ago. In 1993 they changed the shop, and they basically turned all the counters around 90 degrees to give them some more space and more counter positions. In 1994, apparently there was always battles between the Gawler Council and Australia Post about a council levy that they applied to businesses to provide car park spaces. Australia Post always refused to pay it, but one concession they did make in 1994 is they closed off the driveway that used to go onto Tod Street, and that added 2 car park spaces on Tod Street. In 1996, the telephones, which were in the front part right in the corner, were removed because of persistent vandalism. That was the major reason why they took it out. 1997, the actual mail sorting was relocated to the building out the back, which is still in use today. Now, I haven't got the exact date for this. I put circa 2002 because it's the earliest reference I can find to it is when they put in the after hours parcel hatch in the front. It's probably earlier than that, but that's the earliest record I can find of it. Staff. Been lots of postmasters, so I'll just deal with the ones since then. Of course, Harold Marsh died very soon after the other post office was opened. And you sort of feel sorry for the bloke because he still had plenty of years left in his career. He went through all of the telephone exchange development, he went through all of the building of this and setting up of this new post office building. He was also very high up, he was actually acting mayor for a while in Gawler, very high up in the council and very high up in Rotary Club. And of course the Marsh family still has members of the Marsh family in the Rotary Club even today, about 4 generations later. So Ross Cook, who was a member here until he passed away about 4 years ago, and with his wife Margaret. So Ross was here, appointed in 1974 and retired in 1991, so there are the bunyip photos of his appointment and his retirement. And after that, they chose to live in the town and became volunteers and citizens of the year. And one of the things I'm trying to do with the research is to find out what the staff of the post office who lived here also did for the town. So Ross was very heavily involved with the Lions, with the volunteers, the relocation of the locomotive, working at the Visitor Information Centre, and so, you know, a big contributor to the town beyond just doing his job. Ross was succeeded by Erwin Armstrong, and after him Neville Clark. Neville Clark, I only discovered he was a postmaster here about 2 months ago, and that's the only photo I could find of him. And it's very dark because there's one volume of the bunyip which has been damaged in the Heritage Centre, and it's with Art Lab trying to repair it, and so that had to be taken off a microfilm. it's very dark. And both of those are in the period when, of course, everyone was complaining about queues at the post office. Now, I love a nice bit of satire, and there was a lovely letter to the editor about the queues at the post office, where this gentleman wrote, "Old Bill, the well-known seer, oracle and spokesperson-elect for the geriatric corner of the Gawler Arms, their trendy Jurassic bar, pontificated that if you joined the permanent queue at the Tod Street Post Office, you would eventually meet everyone you had ever known in your lifetime." So these were the sorts of things there. Now, one of the beneficiaries of the queues at Gawler was actually the Williston Post Office, because a lot of people just took their business to Williston and met two very friendly ladies to serve them. They did very well. Bob Hindewell, who is probably the most well-known of the surviving postmasters, came here in 1995, and this is a photograph of his appointment, where the headline was, "I promised to make the queue shorter," as was his previous two postmasters. So he was there, and of course one of the ways to make the queue shorter was to put in a vending machine out in the footpath, so people didn't have to go in. They could get their things from there. And of course Leonie, who's with us tonight, worked at the post office as well, so there was occasional photographs of the staff with various promotions, usually Christmas or Mother's Day, would appear in the bunyip. So that was that one there. Then we have another one here with Bob, with the staff of the office. This was for his 40th anniversary as a post employee, and another one there for the recycling. Now, interestingly, Bob has spoken at a couple of reunions we have, and he can get up and he can recite. He's obviously one of these people who used to live by the public service list, so he could recite all the dates he was appointed and promoted and transferred from every part of his career. Now, he's given me his biography where he says he was actually given a package in 2015, but in the transition between Bob leaving and Donna King starting, we have details of two other people, and one of these I knew about, and the other one I only learned about earlier this week when Leonie found some information for me. So when Bob left, he was to be succeeded by a chap called Gerhard Vollmer, who was at Elizabeth at the time. And then Gerhard was going to be succeeded by a lady called Judy Kleeman at Elizabeth. And both of them decided that Gerhard didn't like Gawler, Judy lived in Gawler and liked Gawler, so they somehow managed to organise an exchange, and Judy Kleeman became the postal manager here in 2014. And then she was succeeded by Donna. I first met Donna for the email centenary in 2017, and the Friday before last was Donna's actually last day at the post office, because she's got a promotion. She's now an area manager, and they're looking for a new postal manager. Now, some of the staff that were there, we can't forget about the staff, because sometimes there's 25 staff involved between the delivery centre and the other. This was an astonishing piece that came out of the bunyip. One of the postal clerks in 1973 working at Gawler won a competition to be named Playboy of the Year. And all I know is it was a competition sponsored by, I think it was Whitmont Shirts, and I cannot find anything else about this competition, but it must have been quite substantial, because when you look at the prizes, it was about, was it $13,000 worth of prizes in 1973, which included a boat on a trailer and a GT Falcon and a holiday. Now, if he's still got the GT Falcon, that's probably worth $500,000. So, if anybody knows about Brian Purdy, I'd love to have a talk to him if he's still around. Right, these are various things I've managed to find in the bunyip. Photographs sort of in the last 20 years are extremely difficult to source, so if any of the former employees have photographs, I'd love to see them to get things in better quality. So in 1990 was an electronic post training course that was described. Colin Bloffwich, who will be familiar to a lot of people here, because Colin was at, I think it was 35 years in post, so his retirement was marked with a story in the bunyip. Ray, in the front here. Ray was pictured a couple of times in the bunyip, first of all on his push bike and then secondly on his scooter. So here was Ray and Ray's uniform, and another copy of this picture are in the exhibition in the Heritage Centre. Ron Folland on his retirement days, still sorting letters out the back there. And then, of course, some of the posties, the letter carriers. There's lots of stories about them, but not too many photos. So we have Graham Dorr on his retirement day. Graham was a postie in the 1940s. He then left and worked for up Woomera for many years and then came back and became a postie from the early 70s. When he retired, there were 4 posties in Gawler. I believe there's now 14. Craig Hurdy was a thing, he came up in a pictorial supplement to the bunyip, and Barry Zerner, there's been a couple of stories of Barry, one of which was in Martin Johnson's Significant People Around Gawler series in the book that Martin's just recently published. And I thought it would be appropriate to finish tonight with a couple of the ladies. So we're trying to find out when the first female letter deliverer was in Gawler. We think it was probably in the 70s, but we don't know for sure. But these ones we do know for sure. Narelle Stevens, who delivers in the Hewitt round. So this was pictured in 2009, where it said that she'd been there 11 years, so that puts it back to 1998. And Kayla Rath, who was featured in Daniel Downs' Humans of Gawler series last year. And I really love that picture. So she's got a wonderful smile, and apparently the caption to the photo was, she delivers letters and smiles. And that was her job. So that brings us up to date. Thank you.
Do we have any questions?
Yes. No, we've got one, yes.
When did pensions start in, I don't think there would have been...
Old age pensions are in 1908.
Yeah, when the Murray Street changed, we heard about them, but our street, Jacob Street, the numbers of Jacob Street changed as well.
Yes, it doesn't surprise me. It depends. The formula they came up with is that they would take a major street, and then if you were a secondary street to that major street, they'd start from the major street, and I think the odds were on the left side and the evens on the right side.
Is there any way of tracking, like, we were lucky because we met up with someone who had lived previously in the house, so we know what the number is, but we don't know how the other houses were numbered along the street.
No.
So I don't know how to work that, because it was originally 19 and now it's 30.
I did have a look at the Sands and McDougall's directories at the time for the early 60s to see how they changed, but most of them just have Jacob Street. They don't have a number in them. I mean, a few did, most didn't. And even letters that I have in my collection addressed to Jacob Street just say Jacob Street, so they rarely had a number.
Yeah, the numbers in Jacob Street are very unusual now, because we're in 30, but 28 is down the other side down there.
If you want to see something really unusual, have a walk up Cameron Street. Cameron Street's got, I think, 2 number 1s and 2 number 5s. yes. Right.
I remember when I first started in the post office, about 59, that was about the time that the numbers were changed in the streets. And I was delivering telegrams at the time, but there was a problem for about 3 years after that where mail was put in the wrong box. Posties had to sort of work out where they went, because they just put the mail in the box where it was addressed. And that went for about 2 or 3 years, and all of a sudden it's just sort of cleared up.
Yes, there were appeals in regular times in the papers for the owners of the residences to let their correspondences know that their number had changed. So it was really up to the owner. The council just forced it upon them. So it was actually the council, not the PMG's department, who did it. And Ray's right, there were problems. And I think another instance that was mentioned in the article, there was a road that went between Lindog Road and Gelton Road, which at each end they started at number 1. So they met in the middle. Yes.
I believe during the war all the child endowment and ration tickets were handled by Australia Post.
Yes. Yes, probably ration tickets, certainly during the war. The pensions were before the war. And some of you may remember the little coupon books you used to get for you have a year's worth of pensions. It could be old age, it could be child endowment, it could be widow's pension, and you tear the coupon off and get it handed in. It looks a bit like a chequebook. It's not a chequebook because they were predetermined amounts depending on your means test result. Yes, that's correct.
Back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a coach line by the name of Hill and Company. It ran a 1,000-horse fleet of coaches around South Australia doing mail runs. And in the early days, I'm wondering whether that actually connected into delivering mail from here on or further afield, because they actually had armed guards riding on the coaches for a short period of time.
I have no record of Hills doing anything from here because we had coaches up until the railway came in 1857, and I believe the time when they changed, when the railway got to Smithfield, that's when the coaches started to pick up mail from Smithfield instead of Adelaide, and of course when it got to Gawler, that's the coaches between Adelaide and Gawler as far as mail carriers were concerned finished. But of course that then made Gawler the new coaching centre. And for a while, so we had coaches going to the Barossa, and then up to Clare, up to Burra, up to Kapunda, and then the railway extended up to Kapunda, and that became the new coaching centre. It's a bit hard because we've had claimants for Hills operating in Gawler, but I can't really confirm it because I haven't seen anything. And I was a part of a club that actually organised a reenactment of something that was probably never existed in the first place, which because there was a coach going to Williamstown from Gawler Station, which sort of went up to Sandy Creek, the Cockatoo Valley through to Williamstown, then on to Mount Pleasant. Now I find that difficult to believe because Mount Pleasant was serviced by the line going through Tod Gully, so I really don't know about that. But in my researches, Pinson's had the mail coach contract between Gawler and Williamstown. There was a couple of private names. Hayter and Co was one, Hayter. They had the contract for the thing going up to the Barossa. When the railway line went to Kapunda, those coaches then came out of Freeling rather than Gawler.
Apparently, the mail runs started to go into decline heading towards 1903. The railways were all being extended beyond the city runs. Yes,
well, certainly as the railways extended, the coaches really were only feeders to the railways. So that was there. Earlier this year, I actually gave a talk at Tod Gully Historical Society, so I had a look at the route that went through Tod Gully, which ended up being Adelaide to Mannum. And certainly by just after the First World War, there was certainly a push by the government to get all of the mails motorised. And that was really spelled the end for Hill and Graves as coachmen. And by that time, both of the Graves and Hill were both in their 70s, so they probably didn't have long to go anyway. But if you look in the early 1920s when those businesses were sold up, the property, so it wasn't only the business, but they had huge acreages of land growing hay to feed all the horses, which is something you don't really think about. They had huge areas sort of down sort of Grange Way, so that was huge property value. Plus their depots all around the state, but principally in the city, because they were generally all around the Curry Street area, and depots which went from Curry Street right through to Perry Street or back to not so much Hiney Street. So they were substantial, not just coachmen, but property owners and businessmen in their own right. So there's there.
So that's actually how I came across it, because in my family tree book of 40 pages, they stopped at Neuron, and that was 150 metres off of Wimp Road, where they stopped to change the horses and feed them water and so forth. And they went on down through Columba, Red Hill, all sorts of places like that, towards Clare and beyond.
That's right. The coachmen, if you read the reports of the coachmen were revered heroes because it was a dangerous job. But there was a mail coach turned over in Murray Street and one of the passengers was killed. that was in the 1850s. And when I go back to, when Carlton resigned, there was actually a thought about putting a woman postmaster in charge of the post office because they couldn't find anybody. And we think that woman may have been Stedman's wife, who was probably first put up to be a postmaster here at Gawler. And the government wrote back and said, considering the state that mailmen and passengers arrive off the coaches, we don't consider it an appropriate job for a lady to be handling these sorts of people. That's actually written in the correspondence. Yes. Just because, as I said, the one that overturned in Murray Street, they only found the bloke because they saw the trail of blood coming up from beneath all the luggage that had fallen on top of him and broke his neck. Yes, and that was sort of in front of where the Prince Albert now is.
And the story goes on.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, thanks Martin. That was quite informative and I love the slideshow. Now, you may remember, I don't know, when you were a young kid, I was born in Liverpool in England, and you spoke about the letterboxes in the door. Sort of a long brass thing with a spring-loaded flap. And when we were kids, they weren't used for letterboxes. We used to sneak around houses and lift it up and you could look in the house and see everything in the house. Do you remember those? Thank you very much. I think it's appropriate that I ask Ray Hicks to give a vote of thanks. Right? Thank you.
Well, a couple of posties to go, post office people. I think there's a couple of others out there. Well done. Thank you for tonight's show. I was just going to put my hand up and answer this one letter and parcel delivery. Back in the 60s, when I started, the girls would always want to become postmen. But the theory was that it's a man's job and the girl's job was in exchange, sort of an exchange, and that lasted for a long time. Now, I think the majority of postmen are postwomen now instead of postmen. So, thank you very much for today. You brought back some really good memories there. Some of you people think about posties as being just the normal workers, but we can relate to your life younger and younger, and then all of a sudden you think, oh, I remember the postman back in 20 years ago, you know. So it's good. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for tonight, and in that we've got a parcel for you. See something here.
Thank you very much. Wonderful. Well, I will eat healthily for a couple of days anyway.
A couple of letters in there and a couple of little small parcels. Thank you.
Maybe I can hear it. I don't know.
Hello, my name is Jacinta Weiss. I'm the coordinator of the Cultural Heritage Centre. Welcome to our new exhibition, Down the Line. This exhibition tells the story of communication and the technologies that aided communication in Gawler from the 1840s, when the town was first starting, right through to the 1970s. You'll be able to see rare early letters that were sent by ship. There's telegraph equipment here that came with Charles Tod when he came to Australia. There are also telephone exchange, rare and funky telephones from the 1960s and 70s, and some equipment so you can send your own telegram and play around with that. We have a magneto telephone set up so that you can sit in our little 1960s lounge room and make a call to the telephone box, which is out in the cafe area. So it's a lot of fun. People are really enjoying that. We hope you enjoy our new exhibition, Down the Line.